Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm Jordan and welcome to today's video, which is going to be a nonfiction November reading vlog. I've got 3 nonfiction books that have been sitting on my TBR for a while. November is the perfect time to knock them out. Nonfiction November, as far as I know, is an official readathon. I don't know many of the details as far as who hosts it, what the prompts are, or anything like that, but I do know that November is a very common time to read nonfiction books, so that is what I'm going to take the opportunity to do. It also is going to be a little bit of a glimpse into my life with a newborn. In case you missed my last several videos where I talked about being pregnant with my 3rd child, and then just in my last video I mentioned having given birth. That is what's going on as of the day that I'm starting this. I am at 12 days postpartum, so we are 12 days with baby Kato, almost 2 weeks old. And you know, newborn life is kind of rough, but I am loving it. I'm soaking every minute up. I think we finally got enough routines in place that I can share a little bit about what that looks like. So that's what this video is. It's gonna be a little bit chaotic and scattered because that's kind of what my life is right now. I know that I look awfully tired right now for starting off a video. That's partially because it is early on a Tuesday morning. Normally I would wait until later in the afternoon to start off a video because that's when my tiredness wears off of my face. But on the other hand, with newborn life and with postpartum recovery, I have a feeling this is kind of what it's going to be for the duration of the video, regardless of what time of the day it is. So that's that. All right, let's quickly go through the 3 books that I'll be reading. I'm not going to give too much of a description of any of these books. I will save those for the updates when I can more coherently share in detail what these books are about and what I'm getting out of them, but they are all pretty short, which I'm excited about. And again, I've had them on my shelf for quite a while, at least a couple of them. So the first one that I want to read is Never Split the Difference: Negotiating as If Your Life Depended on It by Chris Voss. This is a book pretty heavily pushed by my workplace. A lot of people have read this book and kind of rave about it as a book that gives strategies for negotiatings in all parts of your life and also all parts of, work and business. Then we have The Culture Map by Erin Meyer, Breaking Through the Invisible Boundaries of Global Business. I do work for a global company and on a global team, so I'm hoping this book will give me some insight to working with people from all different countries and regions around the world with all kinds of different cultures and things that I don't know about and understand, but that can help me connect with people and again, just better do work and business with people who are unlike me. And then last but not least, we've got White Fragility: Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism by Robin DiAngelo. A little bit of a different turn. This has nothing to do with work and business specifically, at least in how I got the recommendation. This is just a book that I have seen around a lot, especially post 2020. And I am always trying to continue my education on anti-racism, how I can reduce my own bias and harm to people of color. And this one is interesting because it is written by a white woman, but it also appears to be for white people. And I'm hoping that it really calls out and challenges the harm that we do as white people and how we can better correct our actions and make a difference and just highlight things that I might be a little bit blind to within myself. That would be ideal. So again, these are the 3 books that I'll be reading in this video, interspersed with B-roll from my chaotic newborn life right now, made only more chaotic with this being my 3rd baby, meaning I have 2 older children running around a lot of the time. Right now they are at daycare, which is the saving grace of the weekdays. They do go to full-time daycare, so that is my time to bond with the baby, to get in my naps, all of those things, hopefully get in some reading. And then evenings and weekends are chaotic family of 5, so I'll share as much of it as I can. But if that sounds good to you, then stay tuned and I will be back once I have my first reading update. Okay, how are we looking? A little rough. It is a few days later. It's first thing in the morning. Why am I choosing this time to update? I don't know. I've got little baby next to me. He is making some noise, so if you hear him, that is life right now. But I've got a pretty major reading update because I've actually finished 2 books for this video. I was hoping and planning to have more maybe midway updates, or at least update once I finished each book, but I ended up reading these 2 books kind of at the same time. The Culture Map I read mostly physically. Just a couple of chapters I ended up using Spotify hours to listen to, but the majority of it I read physically, and I do think that was beneficial to my reading experience because there are some things within the book that it's helpful to see and kind of spend time studying. And then I primarily listened to White Fragility, and this one was a very short and quick audiobook because this book is very quick, and conversely I actually think this one lent itself really well to an audiobook. I don't know who the narrator was. Let me look at that. Okay, it's not narrated by the author. Part of me thought it might have been because it sounded very natural coming out of her mouth, but this one is much more of like a direct to reader. I'm telling you stories. I'm really trying to emphasize this message to you, and I thought it came across audio really well. But let's go back. Let's talk about The Culture Map. So this is a nonfiction book all about interacting with individuals from different cultures. And the way the book starts out is by introducing 8 different scales that cultures can be basically mapped on that help explain interactions between people from different cultures and why they might have different opinions and different experiences during the interactions. Okay, and so here we can see a graphic of the 8 scales with 2 example cultures mapped on these scales. So we have Israel and Russia, but the 8 scales are communicating, evaluating, persuading, leading, deciding, trusting, disagreeing, or scheduling. And each of those scales is linear to where there is a lower extreme and a higher extreme. So for example, if we're on scale number 2, evaluating, some cultures value and focus on direct negative feedback, whereas other cultures focus and prefer indirect negative feedback. And where 2 cultures are relative to each other on that scale can affect how people interact, because if you have one culture that really values direct negative feedback and they give that direct negative feedback to someone in or from another culture that values indirect negative feedback, they might be highly offended by whatever the direct person said. And then the rest of this book goes into detail. Basically, each chapter talks more about each of these scales, and it's written just in a really useful way that includes a lot of images and information about these scales and about a lot of different actual cultures to make this not only an informational book to read once and consume once, but also to have as a reference to be able to actually go in and, like, if I am at work and I'm interacting with someone from Germany, for example, I can actually go into each of these chapters and look at the different scales and map out where is Germany on this scale, where is the United States on this scale, and what am I bringing to this business relationship that might be affecting the way we interact, and how can I kind of cater my method of communication or even temper how I'm receiving information from that person to overall be more effective, because I can put into context why they are speaking the way they are, etc. So I do think this was a really, really useful book, and this is something that I will keep in my physical collection because I am somebody who works with people from a lot of different cultures. I can totally see myself going into this book, getting some actual information and details from these different scales and build a culture map and use that to inform some of my communication and decision making. So that's really valuable. I think I will probably go in and tab like the different chapters and have it immediately obvious what the different scales are and where they are, so I can easily flip to them for reference. But yeah, for that reason, I think it was really useful. Also for that reason, I don't know that this is a very widely recommendable book. If you're someone who very rarely interacts with people from another culture or from another country, I don't think you'll get much value out of this, because it really is focused on the tactical use of these different maps or scales. And it kind of goes beyond like what you would need to know if you were traveling somewhere and you're being a tourist in another country and culture. I think how tourists interact with people is a little bit different than when you have like a working relationship with somebody and a relationship over time with a specific individual from a different culture. So again, I would really only recommend this to people who interact on a global scale and with people from other countries on a daily or regular basis. But if you do, this is a very handy tool to have in your tool belt. Overall, I gave this 3 stars on Goodreads. I think I might bump it up to a 4 because it is just really useful. I am just, again, a little bit hesitant to like widely rave about it and recommend it because it's very, very niche. But for what it is, I think it did a good job communicating it. It was useful. So I did enjoy it, probably like 3.5 stars. All right, and then the other book that I mentioned finishing is White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. This book was so interesting, and I will start by saying I wholeheartedly agree with the message that this book is trying to send. It has a very clear, singular intention, which is this white author is speaking to other white people, not to just tell them that what they do is racist, and really I should be saying us, I should include myself with white people. She's telling us not only are we raised in a racist society surrounded by racist systems and predisposed to have racist behaviors, not only do we need to accept all of that, but also it's hugely important for us to realize that when we are called out for doing something racist, upholding some racist belief, participating in some kind of racist system, we need to dismantle our own white fragility, take ourselves out of the center of that criticism, and be willing to do the work to correct it. And that's a really interesting focus because it's very different from a lot of other racially centered nonfiction books that I've read, especially written by authors of color. This author really is just saying, like, cut the shit. I am also a white person. I also have many biases and predispositions that I have to actively undo, and I am still working on today. So do you. And it does us no good, and it definitely does people of color no good to deny that it's happening or try to ignore it or erase it. We need to address it head on, and that takes a lot of humility. It takes a lot of active and conscious effort to say, I'm not going to center myself in this conversation. I am going to tamp down my pride and do what needs to be done to reverse it. And yeah, I just found that to be a very interesting and important message. And I do think it's important that this book exists and it gets to the right readers. She does have an author's note at the beginning acknowledging that by writing a book about racism as a white person, she is still centering herself and her own voice in this conversation. And she even acknowledges like she doesn't know how to get around that, even though she's very knowledgeable about the subject and she is credentialed. She is an authority able to speak on this topic. She still feels a lot of uncertainty about the fact that she wrote this book and she is a white person. And I think that that is a valid criticism to have about the book if that's something you feel weird about. But also she very plainly states that this should not be the only book about racism that you're reading. You should also be seeking out voices of people of color and other authorities on this topic that can share information to you, and that's important. None of these books or resources should be taken as a one and done, all right, I got my education on anti-racism, I'm good to go. It is a constant process, and this can just be one of many resources to read on the topic. I am rating this book 3 stars, and I think it's mostly because this could really be shortened down into, I don't know, like an article, or it could be talked about as a podcast episode. I don't know. I just feel like this book definitely could be cut down and shortened into its most poignant message, and maybe it wouldn't reach the audience in the same way, or maybe there's something to like repeating a message a few times for it to really sink in. I just think the amount of content in here is not huge. It's already a short book, and I do feel like some of it is kind of repetitive and not as necessary to reinforce the central message. But again, I do wholeheartedly agree with the central message. It's just really not going beyond that. It's not adding a lot of context or examples or anything beyond the bare minimum, and that's okay. I don't think it should have been added to or padded just to make it longer. I just want to acknowledge that, like, even if you could find a summary of this book somewhere, I think it would be useful to read to understand that message. You don't necessarily need to read this entire book to understand the point and for it to hit you enough to actually make a difference in your actions. So I'm rating this one 3 stars, and it's definitely more of a true 3 stars, I think, compared to The Culture Map. So with that, I'm gonna get back to reading my 3rd and final book for this video. I'll be back once I've finished it and can give kind of the final wrap up. I'm gonna finish feeding this baby and hopefully get him happy, but I'll be back in a little bit with that final update. Okay, my friends, I have finished the 3rd and final book for this video. I went ahead and pretty much sped through it all today. It's actually later the same day that I already talked to you. I did take a shower, but no, I did not put on any makeup. So, Never Split the Difference, Negotiating as if your life depended on it. I listened to the audiobook of this book. I mostly listened to it as I was making a Christmas stocking for newest baby. Audiobooks are the perfect knitting activity, and I'm pleasantly surprised by how much I enjoyed the listening experience of this book. To be honest, I was probably least interested and excited to go into this book because the subject matter just seemed the least interesting to me. I am not a very big negotiator. I don't like conflict and, you know, negotiating directly for really anything in life, but especially at work when you're talking things like salaries, budgets, headcounts, all of the things you have to formally negotiate. But this book makes some very good points. One is that it points out that really everything in life is ultimately a negotiation. So not only those more formal negotiations that I just mentioned, but also when you are talking through project decisions at work and a lot of other things at work as well as outside of work. So when you're talking things out with your family members, with your spouse, you have daily negotiations, even with your children. And I really like nonfiction books and principles that can be applied both in work and outside of work. I think it's helpful to remember that everyone is human. Everyone you interact with at work and at home is usually subject to the same biases and things. But also it's helpful to read things that give you tools that you can use at any time in life. So this is definitely much more widely recommendable because you don't need to do formal negotiations as your job in order to get lessons from this book, to have learnings, and to use things from the book. So I enjoyed that. Also, this book has a lot more storytelling than I would have expected before going into it, and it makes for a much more engaging read. So the subtitle of this book is Negotiating as if your life depended on it, and this author is a former FBI hostage negotiator. So literally whenever there's a hostage situation and it's escalated to the FBI, this guy would get on the phone with the hostage takers and negotiate with them to get them whatever they needed or wanted in order to get those hostages home safely. And the reason that's kind of notable and particularly interesting for this book is that he makes the point that as a hostage negotiator, there's no room to split the difference. When you're talking about people's lives, it's all or nothing. Either you get everything you want and that person comes home safely, or they don't, and that's horrific in the worst case scenario. So the typical methods of negotiating where like you make an offer, they make a counter offer, and you just meet in the middle, that doesn't work. And he explains why that doesn't work in his line of work and also why that should not be your negotiation strategy in general ever, no matter what. And so the storytelling piece of it is that each chapter he has kind of a lesson he's trying to tell, but he starts with an actual hostage situation that he has been in and talks through how he either used the strategy that he's outlining or maybe didn't use the strategy and could have, but it just adds a little bit of context and richness to the strategies and lessons that he's talking about and makes it more interesting to hear about because you're hearing actual stories of these hostage negotiations. So that's really interesting to listen to. And I wasn't exactly expecting that because this book, I've talked about multiple times how it's very popular in my workplace. A lot of people have read and recommend this book. And I was part one time of this work book club that wasn't really a book club because it was specifically using this like app and service called Blinkist, which basically takes nonfiction books and culls them down into like 15-minute sort of podcast episode or articles for you to be able to get the main points of a book without taking the time to read an entire book, which I do think can be useful if it's that or nothing. And if you're not much of a reader, I can see how that would be a useful service to still get a lot of the good nuggets from nonfiction books, especially because I have mentioned that some nonfiction books, I do think actually you can get the main point across without reading the entire book. This, however, is kind of proving the counterpoint because in that article I did, or whatever it's called, the little 15-minute blink or snippet or whatever, it gave the lessons and strategies, but it did not give the stories. And actually those add so much to the book that I would much more strongly recommend reading this whole book than just reading a summary. So with all of that, all right, what did I think about the content of this book? Some of the concepts in this book are really good, really interesting, and are counterintuitive or are not something that are common sense. And I always appreciate that in books when it's talking about or making a point that you wouldn't have come to that conclusion on your own. It kind of proves to you why it's true. I think this book does some of that, which I appreciate. I do have a little bit of hesitancy or I don't know, resistance or skepticism about how hostage negotiations should be taken as like the gold standard of negotiations, because it feels very different from a lot of the negotiations that I have in my daily life and especially my work life. In this book, kind of tries to actively disprove some theories and strategies that were previously used by top negotiators that focus a lot on like logic and calculations. I still think a lot of that is useful, especially when you're in an environment with a lot of other knowledgeable negotiators, because one point he makes here is that a lot of negotiation is playing on people's emotions and their humanity, again, especially in hostage negotiations, where oftentimes the people holding other people hostage are operating out of a lot of fear and everything is heightened because it is so life and death. But when you're negotiating non-life and death items and when you're going into more formal negotiations, everyone is kind of prepped with what the conversation is going to be, what the offers and counter offers might be. And I feel like it does lend itself to needing a different strategy. And I don't know, sometimes I feel like the old school methods of negotiation have to have some merit in more formal negotiations. I don't know. Again, I don't consider myself to be a good negotiator at all, so maybe I am just wrong. But it feels like this book is taking itself maybe a little bit too seriously with some of the concepts, because most things we're negotiating are not so serious. But I don't know. So again, I think I'm gonna rate this book 3 stars. And I feel like I've got three 3-star books here that are all very different in why they're 3 stars. Honestly, again, the culture map, I think I would bump up to 4 stars, and maybe I will in the future if I come back and reference it. I did go ahead and add tabs to each of the chapters, as well as any other notable like graphs and figures that I consider to be useful. And I'm planning on keeping this here in my home office and referencing it whenever I can once I go back to work and want to use some of these concepts. This is a 3.5, maybe 4-star book because I really enjoyed reading it. I think it's really helpful and useful, but it's the book that I would least widely recommend. I think it's really specific just to people who need this in their daily work or other life. Then White Fragility, a 3-star book. I think this is completely the opposite, where a lot of people need to either read this book or understand this concept. If you are white, this should pretty much be required reading, but it's a little bit more easily summarizable. Is that a word? I don't know. So if you know, obtaining this book is difficult for you, or making the time to read through the whole book doesn't sound appealing to you, then even if you can find a summary about what this book is about, I do think it's a very powerful and important message. And then last but not least, we've got Never Split the Difference, which I think is also very widely recommendable, but I don't know that I agree with every single point and application of this book that it tries to make. So I would take this book with a little bit of nuance, of course, apply a grain of salt to some of the lessons you learn in here, and I think it could be still very useful to pick and choose kind of what strategies and things you take from this book. But ultimately, I would recommend it. I would recommend all of these books. I am very glad that I finally made time for all of these books. Some of them have been sitting on my shelves for a while, and I hope that I use them, and the things that I learned from these books, I hope that I can apply them to my life and my work life and everything like that. I definitely will continue to be on the lookout for other books, other nonfiction books, other fiction books that can help me continue to learn and grow as a person. I find that very important and valuable. So let me know if you have any favorite nonfiction books that you would recommend on any of these topics, or any other topics, books that really, you know, changed your life and you think about and use often. I would love to hear and kind of start restocking up on my nonfiction book collection so I can have more to read in the future. But otherwise, let me know if you have read any of these books that I read in this video. Let me know if I convinced you to pick any of them up if you haven't. And other than that, I don't think I have anything else. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you in my next one.